Okay, I get the title is provocative, but hear me out. Ever wondered why Christians get so snippy about anyone who gets excited for their accomplishments? Why are folks in Christianized societies so afraid to take pride in themselves? And what is pride anyway? Let's find out. Kairate! Happy Pride Month, everyone. I have actual LGBT content planned down the line, but this topic grabbed me by the brain and, well, you know how ADHD is. This was a long one. I was initially inspired to look into these questions when I studied Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and found out that he and other Greeks didn't consider pride a vice. I also realized that my initial reaction to that section came from latent Christianity, and given that the New Testament was Greek in origin, it made me wonder where the idea that feeling good for yourself was a sin originated from. There's gonna be a lot of history and mythology in this one before we get to the Christians, but I promise it's worth it. Please stick with me. As always, all links to all of my sources will be in the description below where I could provide links, but for this one, there's a bunch of citations for where I couldn't, because I had to tap some books and some articles that I couldn't get on JSTOR. Starting with Aristotle, in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 4, Chapter 3, he defines pride as an accurate estimation of oneself, particularly in reference to doing and deserving great things. He goes into extreme detail describing other states of affairs, referring to excessive belief in one's worth as hubris and minimizing one's worth as excessive humility, both of which are unhealthy. In particular, he's quite concerned with the idea of pride as an essential virtue, referring to it as the crowning virtue and stating that pride cannot be found without all the other virtues that he talks about in the text. This is concurrent with Greek mythology. Often, pride, which in mythology is expressed as boasting of one's accomplishments and one's piety, even when making offerings, is rewarded. But hubris, which usually takes the form of spiting the gods or bragging that you're better than them, is punished. Think of when Actaeon got turned into a stag and hunted like a wild animal after bragging that he was better than Artemis at hunting, or the story of Arachneia, who bragged that she was better than Athena at weaving. Athena turned her into a spider for that one. Admittedly, spiders are pretty cool, and I get that some guys want to be hunted down like beasts, but it's still not a good idea to tick off the gods. Pride, however, is seen as an essential component to a healthy sense of self and to the pursuit of virtue throughout Greek culture. Given this, then, and the Greekness of Luke and Revelation in particular, where did this notion of pride as hubris come from? My first thought was to look into the Tanakh, given that Christianity is said to have formed from a messianic Jewish cultus around Jesus of Nazareth. But what I found there actually surprised me. In a paper in Vetus Testamentum in 2004, John Dixon and Brian Rosner looked into this very question. According to the authors, a distinction must be drawn between social humility, which is defined as lowering oneself before equals or lessers, and religious humility, which is lowering oneself before Yahweh. They too recognize that within Greek and Roman ethics, social humility was not considered to be morally advisable or sound. While searching through the Tanakh for answers, what they found was that later rabbinical literature, thought to be influenced by Christianity, put forward the idea of humility as a social virtue, but that the language of the Tanakh itself does not support this. In other words, it might be the Christians' fault that so much of the Talmud talks about social humility. The first argument they break down is the idea that the dichotomy struck between the meek and the wicked in Psalm 37, 11-17 is meant to be a push towards social humility, when the Hebrew word used there actually denotes a unity between the poor and the downtrodden of the time. The psalm urges the downtrodden to put their faith in Yahweh, the authors argue, rather than espousing any idea of debasing themselves before their oppressors. In other words, it was actually anti-revolutionary language rather than a command to debase themselves. No writing for the Hebrews. The next section talked about Zephaniah 2:3, which reads, "Seek the Lord, all you impoverished of the land who do his commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility, and perhaps you may be hidden on the day of the Lord's wrath." This section refers to Moab and Ammon, who are accused of exalting themselves over other peoples, which admittedly looks a lot like the modern interpretation of pride by Christianity. However, according to the authors, it's actually a condemnation of their refusal to submit to Yahweh yet again. In chapter 2, verse 15, Assyria is said to declare itself, "I am, and there is no one else," which is placing itself above Yahweh or in the position of godhood. That's the pride here, or put another way, Greek hubris. Strike 2. The paper is linked below and contains numerous examples of misinterpretation of humility throughout the Old Testament, but I think it's important to bring up one more example from it, described by the authors as the central talking point of arguments of humility. Numbers 12:3 describes Moses as more humble than anyone else on earth. Earlier in the paper, they argue that the Hebrew adjective there, anah, means humility before Yahweh or religious humility. For those who believe in Mosaic authorship, which is silly by the way, he's basically calling himself the most faithful man on earth. Talk about a humble brag. Go down there, shoot me in the comments, I relish in it. It's worth noting that, in the intertestamental period, according to Daniel B. Levine when discussing Josephus's Jewish Antiquities, the common Jewish interpretation of the Tanakh still aligned with the Greek distinction between pride and hubris. Josephus, in particular, uses the word hubris throughout the text to describe the idea of putting oneself before Yahweh. Aight, well, it didn't come from the Tanakh then, that's clear. Where else can we look? What about the Canaanites? Canaanite mythology was syncretized throughout the Tanakh, and some scholars, though it's hotly debated, believe that the Hebrew religion may have emerged from the Canaanites in the first place. I reached out to my Canaanite reconstructionist friend Chrissy H. to help me look into the issue. She drew my attention to two particular mythological passages of Canaanite origin that deal with these themes. The first, and newer of the two, was Isaiah 4:12-15. Wait, that's the Tanakh again, what gives? Well, the passage was most likely of Canaanite origin. Remember the syncretism that we talked about a second ago? According to Ulf Oldenburg in a German journal I'm not even going to pretend that I know how to pronounce, and Hugh Rowland Page Jr. in The Myth of Cosmic Rebellion, the initial tale here is one likely derived from Canaanite mythology, a story about how the god Athtar attempted to usurp the god El Elyon for supremacy. Here, the god Athtar in his hubris wanted to take the high god's place, but fails to do so. In the context of Isaiah, this tale is taken and reworked to replace Ashtar with the Babylonian king, and how he attempted to usurp the authority of Yahweh, thus discussing the detrimental nature of one's hubris, not the concept of social humility. I strike one for the Canaanites, thinking that social humility was positive. Well, what about something older? Chrissy then drew my attention to the Epic of Akkad, a story in which the titular hero makes a misogynist rear end of himself by bragging to a goddess about his manliness and getting his face murdered in for it. Specifically, according to a translation by Simon B. Parker, the good old boy says to the goddess Anat when she offers him immortality in exchange for his enchanted bow, "Maid, don't beguile me. To a hero your guile is slime. In the end, a man gets what as his fate, glaze is poured on his head, lie all over the skull. The death of all I shall die, I too shall die and be dead. And another thing I will say, bows are weapons of warriors. Will womankind now be hunting?" Big oof there, pal. In a stunning contrast between Anat's pride, again defined here as her accurate recognition of her own worth, and Akkad's hubris, Anat kneels before her father El, giving him the due recognition through prostration, and asks permission to lay waste to Akkad's face. She gets it, and convinces a buddy to smash his skull in. I wasn't kidding. His face was no more. According to H.L. Ginsberg in the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research, the specific word used to cite the reason for Akkad's demise translates to hubris in the Greek sense. Believing he was greater than the goddess simply for being male brought his end, and her pride allowed her to deliver justice. Note also that pride here allowed her to recognize her lower standing than El. She acted accordingly and was rewarded for it, just as Akkad's hubris was punished. Same pattern as before. We're no closer than before to determining where Christians got these ideas from. Before we dig into the New Testament, I'd like to examine one more adjacent culture to the Christians at the time, just to make sure that we haven't missed anything. The ancient heathens. Ancient mythology was often used as a teaching tool for children and young adults to learn how to properly worship and what sort of conduct was expected of them. In the Poetic Edda, a section called the Grimnismal, or the Words of Grimnir, details a story that outlines their feelings on pride and hubris. In its prose opening, Frigg and Odin are discussing how they raised two of their children. Odin brings up that his foster son is a king, where hers has married into another tribe and isn't as successful. Frigg counters that his foster son is inhospitable to guests and will even torture them if he thinks there are too many. Odin puts down a wager that this is false, and Frigg sends her waiting maid to test this out. Turns out, he does end up torturing somebody innocent at her suggestion that the innocent person, Grimnir, might be after him. Paranoid jerk. This story exemplifies that bragging isn't necessarily wrong unless you can't back up your words. In other words, pride is acceptable while hubris is not. Hubris in Norse stories is always showcased as bragging followed by a failure to follow through on one's words when challenged. Bragging when one can back up their claims, however, is not punished. Although the Havamal was first written down in the 13th century, some verses and stanzas appear to date back as far as the 9th or 10th centuries and may even be older than that in oral tradition. Considered to be the words of Odin, it's a pretty succinct text on how they viewed morality. Havamal 79 reads thus: "If a foolish man succeeds in getting wealth or the love of a woman, his pride increases but not his common sense. He continues with steadily increasing illusions." Here too, we see a distinction between pride and hubris. If you only go for material things, you won't gain wisdom, but will instead end up crossing the line from pride to hubris. What we see here is a consistent pattern in ancient Near Eastern and European religions of pride and hubris distinguished from one another. A healthy sense of self-worth is good, thinking you're better than the gods is bad. In other words, Aristotle wasn't an outlier, the Christians were. So what gives? I would put forward that Paul had a lot to do with it. Going back to Dixon and Rosner, they cite the all-too-famous letter to the Philippians, specifically chapter 2 verse 3, as the first mention of social humility as a virtue, and utterly unique in the ancient world. I'd like to dive into that a bit, and to see where in the emerging mythology of the Christian cultist that idea might have stemmed from. The discussion that follows is my understanding of the Greek and the usage of the language in the New Testament. I used Bible Hub to pull it up, and the link to that is below. A common translation of the verse, the ESV, states, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." Looking closer at the wording, conceit here is a translation from kenodoxian, a word used nowhere else in the New Testament. It derives from kenos or kenosis, which means empty or emptying, and doxa, which means opinion. I find it interesting that Paul chose to emphasize doxa with kenos because doxa is often contrasted with episteme, or knowledge, in ancient writing. Opinion has a lower standing than knowledge, and Paul drove the point home by calling it an empty opinion. If you delve deeper into context, you find kenos again in the word ekenosen in verse 5, but this time referring to Jesus, specifically how Jesus emptied himself of his humanity and hubris and became a vessel for God's will, including allowing the Romans, who were lesser than he as the purported son of Yahweh, to put him to death for breaking Roman law because Yahweh commanded it. The idea of mirroring Christ's attitudes is pervasive throughout Paul's writings, both those confirmed by linguistic scholars to be his and those later proven to be falsely attested to him. Colossians contains 2 references to the word for humility, tapenophresen, used in Philippians. The first references false self-debasement and angel worship, and the other self-debasement following the laws involving fasting and refraining from sensual pleasure. I guess some of the Christians at the time were really into the whole masochism thing. Tapenophrasene derives from 2 words again, tapenos, or lowliness, and sophrosene, which means of sound mind and character. It's juxtaposed in these passages and adds up to a larger picture. Paul, and someone pretending to be Paul, commands his followers to behave, quote, like Jesus, by debasing themselves even before their equals, and redefines pride from being a healthy estimation of oneself to being a manifestation of hubris. If you like yourself, you must not love Yahweh, because Jesus was so willing to serve that he let his lessers punish him for a crime that was of human law, not of divine, despite being able to prevent it. Paul sweetens the pot in Philippians by reminding his followers that Jesus got the highest place in paradise for his willingness to endure suffering in the name of Yahweh. So there you have it. We have Paul to thank for the Christian self-hate. I guess the next question here is, why care? The debate about the effect of unreasonably low self-esteem, as I'd like to call it, Paul's humility, and its relationship to violence and crime has raged for decades. I'd like to point you to one particular paper I think does an excellent job of controlling for numerous variables to show how low personal self-esteem can lead to outward aggression and hostility. The paper was published in the journal Psychological Science in April 2005 by Donnellan, Robbins, Moffat, Caspi, and Callie H., last name that I can't pronounce that starts with a T. There's a link in the description below if you want to take your shot at it. It describes 3 studies that attempt to disentangle narcissism from low self-esteem and to showcase that even from a young age, aggression is directly linked to low self-esteem. In fact, the paper goes as far as to state that even though the question of what narcissism even is falls out of the scope of the study, it's clear from the findings that it operates at least somewhat independently of low self-esteem. Other researchers have proposed that narcissism may be a way that some people compensate externally for subconscious self-hate. I tend to agree with this view, having been raised by at least one clinically diagnosed narcissist, though I highly suggest you do some of your own digging and don't take the one paper that I've cited as the end-all on the issue. It's good to be skeptical. In other words, we should care about this question because the hegemonic rule that Christianity currently holds over society means that many of us are indoctrinated from birth to downplay our own accomplishments, and that there's a decent amount of evidence out there to show that this is harmful. Some Christians even latch onto a sense of superiority over others because of their faith to make up for it, particularly emphasizing the hell narrative to make up for their wounded self-worth. Y'all are going to hell, I'm gonna be happy, you'll see. It can help explain a lot of the vitriol non-Christians face from angry Christians when we question their ideas, and the pain that many of us who deconverted feel when trying to take pride in our own accomplishments. Or, in my case, the extremely negative reaction I had to Aristotle presenting pride as a virtue. It might be worth looking at your own beliefs and attitudes to see if you carry any of this baggage into your faith or non-faith. Why keep hurting yourself because a grumpy old man in Rome told you to? Seems silly to me. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and kick the notification bell to stay up to date on whatever crazy topic I've decided to over-research this week. Pop down into the comments section and let me know how much you hate my awful puns and snarky commentary, or even what you learned if that's your gig. It took a ton of research to put this together, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Special thanks to Callan for suggesting looking into the Havamal and Grimnismal for a heathen perspective, and to Chrissy for providing me with the research material I used during the Canaanite portion. Both of you were a huge help. Thank you also to Gaelic Knox for your amazing artwork as always, and to all of you for sticking around through this video. I know it was a long one. And remember, we're stronger together.